Started. Aisha was just going to say a few words and then we'll go around to introductions of the board members.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to read a statement on behalf of the Attorney General. On behalf of the California Department of Justice, I want to convey our deep appreciation to all members of the RIPA board and the members of the public who are participating in today's subcommittee meeting. The work of the subcommittee and the RIPA board is more important now than ever. George Floyd's family, our communities, our country as a whole are in such pain right now. George Floyd's tragic and unacceptable death and other recent events have brought so many societal wounds to the forefront. We are in a pivotal time in our history. For all of us in law enforcement, we need to open our hearts, our minds as never before as we listen to all those who are speaking out against the use of force by law enforcement. We also need to engage more deeply with each other and our communities to come up with meaningful systemic solutions. As we honor the memory of George Floyd and work together to seek justice, we need to find a path forward as we reckon with the past. Thank you again, all of you, for being a part of this critical work. Thank you.
Oops,
With
sorry,
that,
I was muted. Sorry, board
that's
co-chairs.
okay. Yes, I was just going to say that. Thank you.
So Doug or Chief Swing, would either of you like to kick it off with introductions?
Sure, I'll go first. I'm Douglas Oden. I've been had the pleasure of being a co-chair of this subcommittee. This is my fourth year on the board and my last official meeting as a RIPA board member. My term is coming to an end. I do want to say it's been a great experience. I've met a lot of good people, got to know a lot of good people, but the challenges ahead, I think, for the remaining board members is immense. The racial profiling is a part of the problem. As we see, police violence is a big issue, not only in California, but throughout the nation. And racism is still alive and well, and we have to address that. I think what's good about this board, the fact that we have law enforcement individuals as well as community activists working together to find a solution. I think that's the key to getting some positive progress. And I look forward to continuing to watch the board from afar and wish it well. And I think you're under the great leadership of Chief Swain. And if we get another new co-chair, I'm sure that individual will do a great job.
Well, Doug, thank you for your work on the board for the last 4 years. We'll have a chance, I think, at the end of our agenda to acknowledge you and others with some additional appreciation. So I certainly thank you for that. It's been my pleasure to serve with you as the co-chair for the last year or so. I'm David Swing, representing the California Police Chiefs Association. And we also have a new board member that we're welcoming. And out of respect for not mispronouncing her last name, I will let her introduce herself when the time comes. So welcome.
Does that mean that I should introduce myself, or are the other?
I think now's a good time.
Absolutely. All right, that's my pleasure. So my name, thank you, Chief Swing. My name is Lily Kajavi, and I am actually a mathematician at Loyola Marymount Department of LMU, which is in Los Angeles. And I'm very pleased to be part of the board. I'm interested broadly in issues in the intersection of mathematics and social justice, and some more specifically issues around law and policing. And I think this is critical work that the board is doing and we all know that the public concerns about these issues are not new, but that there's truly we're at a time of heightened awareness, and the testimonials we're hearing and seeing in California, but really across the nation. And so I hope this creates a real opportunity for the board to not only continue the work it's been doing, but for the board and the public to really have a real impact. So I'm very pleased to be part of it. And David, you can call me Lily. Thank you.
Thank you. Other board members would like to introduce themselves prior to our kicking off?
Sure. I'm Steve Raphael, professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. I've been on the board for about a year, and I can't think of a more important activity for any of us to be engaged in right now than the work of the RIPA board. And so I'm very, very privileged to be here.
I'm Andrea Guerrero, and I am also coming to the end of my term, and I echo everything that my fellow San Diegan Doug has said. I think in the aftermath of now going on 10 days of protest, I think the work of this board is absolutely critical to addressing some of the challenges we face in racial identity profiling, and finding real, meaningful, sustainable solutions that change the systems, right? Change the systems of accountability so that we can all feel safe.
Thank you. I think I see one more board member. Mr. Barbaro?
Yes, pass the board is on. Pass the board is on.
Okay. So any other board members who would like to introduce themselves before we move on to the next part of our agenda?
Yes, J. Edgar Boyd just joined.
And I see Oscar Barbaro raising his hand as well. No? You're kind of in the shadows there, sir, so it's hard to...
Yes, Edgar Boyd, Los Angeles, just joined.
Would you like to introduce yourself, Reverend Boyd?
Yes, I'm Pastor J. Edgar Boyd, First Family Church in Los Angeles.
Great, welcome.
Not sure you hear me.
I got you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Yes, I can hear you as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Mr. Barbaro? I can't hear you.
He just said in the chat box it seems like we cannot hear him. So we can try to do some technical assistance on that front.
Okay. Well, we can.
He is here.
Yes, he's here, and we're glad that he is.
As a stopgap, if he has a phone handy, he could also call.
Can you hear me now?
For an audio.
Yes, sir.
Good, great.
We got you.
Okay. I'm Oscar Barbaro. I'm the president of the California Public Defender Association. Been on the board since 2016 when it started. And I really hope that the actions of this board will have an impact on what is happening across this state and across this country.
Great. Glad you got the audio component worked out.
I don't know what is happening.
Okay, glad it's working. Any other board members that would like to introduce themselves? Okay, we're going to move on to item number 2, the approval of our October 10th and November 6th, 2019 subcommittee minutes. Is there a motion to approve?
I move that we approve the minutes of October 10th, 2019. And what's the other date?
November the 6th.
and the one of November 6th, 2019.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Any discussion about the minutes? All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Chief Swing, for minutes purposes, if we could just do a roll call vote, just to make sure we're getting everybody's vote. Unless there's no abstentions or objections and everybody's voting aye, then we can do it.
Can I ask a point of information? Will it affect our quorum for approval if I abstain, since I wasn't part of those meetings?
It will not, but you are still, as a matter of board process, you're still able to vote to, even if you were not present.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Then we'll do a roll call vote. Is DOJ staff, would you like?
Sure, I'm happy to assist since I can see everyone.
Okay.
So it was and it was the first by Doug, and it was seconded. Was that Oscar who seconded it, or Pastor?
Yeah.
It was Oscar. Okay, great. Okay, I'll just go. Pastor Kajabi.
Okay, I'll approve then.
Okay,
Yes.
and Doug.
Aye.
Andrea, do you approve the minutes?
Aye.
Swing. Chief Swing, are you?
Aye.
You're an aye. Okay.
Yep, aye.
Okay, Steve, Raphael.
I'm an aye.
Okay, Oscar,
Aye.
and Pastor Boyd.
Aye.
Okay, great. Motion carried. Wonderful. We can move on to the next item. Before we actually move on to our speaker and discussion, Anna is just going to talk briefly about the issue of the mandate and funding, because that's come up at several. So I know some of you have heard this already, but it's come up as an issue at the full board meeting and at multiple subcommittee meetings. So we just wanted to give you an update on that. So I'll turn it over to Anna.
Good afternoon. Very briefly, for folks that haven't been on the previous subcommittee meetings this year, the DOJ has received many questions about reimbursement related to stop data reporting, and the Commission on State Mandates received a test claim for RIPA reimbursement, and on May 22nd, the Commission partially approved the test claim. We just wanted to note that the deadline for filing comments or proposed modifications related to the reimbursement is June 12th, and documents detailing the parameters and guidelines are available on the Commission on State Mandates website, and I'll add a link to the chat. That's all.
I have a quick question. Do we know why it was only partially approved?
I don't have the details of the proposed decision. I'm not sure if someone else on the call has additional information.
Sorry, I was muted. I can pull it up. Let me pull it up for us. Sorry, I'm looking for all of the information. So you know what, let me, I don't want to take time away from the panel. So if you don't mind, I'm going to pull up the information, and then I will get back to you on this when we open it up for discussion and next steps, and
That's fine.
provide you with the information.
Good afternoon. This is LaWanda, board member.
Hi, LaWanda. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Did you want to do
Thank
an
you.
introduction? You're welcome to do an introduction if you'd like.
No, I'm fine.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
And this is
Are we
Allison.
moving on?
This is Allison. I can just provide you all quickly. Basically, the commission finding was that the certain sections of the penal code, like 13519.4, don't impose any activities on local government and therefore are not reimbursable state mandated programs. But they found that Government Code Section 12525.5 did constitute a state mandated new program or higher level of service and did impose costs mandated by the state. And those costs were only on city and county law enforcement agencies that employ peace officers, other than those in a custodial setting. And they, listed out the different reporting activities. And so I think they did not feel that the test claim statutes and regulations imposed a state mandated program for K through 12 school districts or community college school districts that are authorized but not required to employ peace officers, and for which the provision of police protection services is not an essential and basic function. And then they also felt like the test claim statutes and regulations don't impose a state mandated program when a city or county assigns their peace officer employees out to work for other government or private entities based on a contract or memorandum of understanding. And so I think a lot of it is based on the particular codes that each agency is citing and the particular circumstances of the peace officers and the work that they're trying to get funding for. But we will put a link to their decision in the chat box, and it's quite a long document of about 70 to 80 pages. And so we will put that in the chat so you can take a look, so everyone can take a look at it if you'd like. But that's the gist, basically, is that different, the different areas of reimbursement are really dependent on what the statute or regulations lay out for what is reportable and who is doing the reporting and whether those are required by statute.
Follow up.
Okay. Are we on to item number 3?
Yes. I think that for that we can turn it over to Kevin.
Okay. And if I can just ask board members as we go into this presentation, if you're not speaking, to put your mics on mute so that there's limited background noise in the presentation.
Great. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm Kevin with the Department of Justice Research Center. As you all will recall, at the November meeting from last year's report, there was a lot of discussion surrounding the methods to be included in your 2020 annual RIPA report, looking at the 2018 data. And so that meeting was also posted on the AG's YouTube and was, I don't know if it was live streamed, but it was posted. And some of the researchers and staff that work at for a board in our sister state of on a sister board in Connecticut, actually saw your meeting and saw the discussions that you were having at that point during the year, and wrote a letter with some of their thoughts on the types of analyses that they do in Connecticut for their racial profiling prohibition advisory board in Connecticut. And so if you're looking at the meeting materials, it starts on page 13. They wrote a letter talking about some of the analyses that they performed, some of their thoughts about the discussion that was taking place last November, as well as just their process in general. And so they wrote this to the board, so we're providing in your meeting materials, but we also had a couple opportunities early on this year to speak with the members from Connecticut that reached out. One of those people being Ken Barone, and another person being Dr. Matt Ross. And so we're lucky to have both of them here to give a presentation today. Ken Barone is a project manager from the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy at Central Connecticut State University. And he works as a project manager for Connecticut's Racial Profiling Prohibition Act board. He's co-authored, since 2012, he's co-authored numerous reports analyzing stop data for evidence of discrimination in police data. He's also co-authored a report on the use of electronic control devices by state and local police. And he's also, in addition to his work in Connecticut, has served as a project consultant in the states of Oregon and Rhode Island, helping those states get stop data collection programs off the ground. And so we're very lucky to have his input, and we're happy that he's here to give a presentation for us today to kind of talk about what they do in Connecticut and how it may apply here in California. And then with Ken, we also have, as I said, Dr. Matt Ross, who is an assistant professor in the Economic Sciences Department and Computational Justice Lab at Claremont Graduate School. He also serves as a visiting scholar at the Wagner School of Public Service at New York State University. Matt is an applied microeconomist, and frequently collaborates with scholars in different disciplines. Matt has a variety of different research interests, one of which is empirically testing for police discrimination and understanding the role of police officer experience in formalized training. Matt has served as a statistical advisor and authored 8 of the analyses examining policing data for evidence of discrimination in both Connecticut and Rhode Island. And so we also have him on the call as well to assist with the presentation. And so we've already had a couple conversations with both Ken and Matt, and they've been helpful for us at the department in kind of gaining some insight into how they do things in Connecticut and in Rhode Island. And so we're glad that they agreed to come here and discuss their process more with you all. So with that, I'll pass it over to Ken, who has a presentation.
Great, thanks, Kevin, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to if you just give me 1 second, I'm going to share my screen so that the folks that are on the computer can watch as we go through our presentation. And for those on the phone, just know that the material had been previously provided in your meeting packet. And also, we're going to talk about what we do in Connecticut, and we'll be able to guide you through what we're talking about. If you just give me 1 second. We practiced this earlier. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see my screen now, which is a brief PowerPoint presentation, just so you understand the format. It's a short presentation, maybe 15, 20 minutes we'll go through, and want to walk you through what we've done here in Connecticut, which is a lot of the approach that we've taken in Connecticut, you have adopted in Rhode Island, which we were really happy to see. And Matt Ross, who's joining us as well, he's essentially our lead researcher, and he's been our lead researcher in Connecticut since we started this work in 2012. We've been at this in the state of Connecticut for the better part of 10 years. Keep in mind, most states passed laws outlawing racial profiling and requiring some data collection initiative well over 20 years ago. We were one of the early adopters, but we had never really, until 2011, 2012, thought about putting together a comprehensive, robust data collection and analysis system. Just by way of background as well, we actually were invited out to California back, I believe, in 2015 when you were passing your legislation. We were invited out by, I believe at the time it was Representative Weber. And so we testified before the California legislature about what we were doing in Connecticut and tried to provide some advice around the way that your bill should be crafted. And so because of that invitation, we've always just taken an interest in where California has been in the implementation process. And we're really, it's been really wonderful to see how this process has evolved for your state, how far you've come, and all the progress that you have made. And so just real quickly, the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy, it's a public policy, nonpartisan institute out of one of our five. We have five public universities here in the state of Connecticut, so Central Connecticut State University. We focus on a variety of policy issues, predominantly related to criminal justice reform issues. In 2011, our institute at the university was tasked by our General Assembly here in Connecticut to help oversee the design of the law that was passed to rewrite our racial profiling statutes. And so we had a fairly publicized issue here in Connecticut where the FBI had come in. They opened a patterns and practice investigation against a particular police department, arrested a handful of officers for violating the civil rights of, in particular, the Latino community. And that there was an outcry as to why the state hadn't known that there was profiling potentially happening. And so they went back, they rewrote their racial profiling statutes, and they asked our institute to help them implement it. The first thing we did was put together an advisory board similar to what you've done in Rhode Island. We have a 26-member advisory board made up of a variety of partners, right? Different stakeholders from advocates to law enforcement to different individuals and state agencies. Being a much smaller state than California, we've been fortunate to be able to meet for the better part of 8 years on an almost monthly basis. So we meet between 10 and 12 times a year. We have a number of working committees that meet when the larger advisory board isn't meeting. We've learned a lot over the last 8 years about what works and what doesn't work. And since the law was passed and established, we have published 5 statewide analyses of traffic stop data. We've analyzed data from through 2018 with our most recent traffic stop analysis being released just last month on May 5th. All of our reports are public. They're available on our website, which is ctrp3.org. Now, I'm sure that these are some conversations that you've had back in 2011, 2012, when we were implementing our system. We were in the midst of a fiscal crisis, which a lot of states, I think, were experiencing post the recession of 2008. And so we were really tasked to design an analytical system that could be replicated every year in a fiscally challenging environment. And so when we sat around the table with researchers and practitioners alike, the perfect analysis that you might like to do for an individual police department could be fiscally challenging if you had to replicate that every year. And so that was always part of just as a way of background, how we developed the system we developed and why we made decisions we made. It was done because in Connecticut, albeit a much smaller state than California, we have 107 police departments that are required to be analyzed on an annual basis. And so you have to design an analysis that can do that in a thoughtful way, but that can be replicated each year. So the first thing we did in Connecticut was we looked around the country and said, well, what are other states doing? We're not the first state to try and collect traffic stop data. Keep in mind, by the way, in Connecticut, we only collect traffic stop data. Pedestrian stops are not very common in Connecticut. We don't have many major cities. And so interactions with police in motor vehicles is is much more common than pedestrian interactions. So we only collect data on traffic stops. And so what we found is that census-based benchmarking was the most common method being used across the countries throughout the early 2000s to evaluate racial disparities in traffic stops. And some jurisdictions were doing some interesting stuff. But, you had Miami-Dade County back in the early 2000s using accident data as a potential benchmark. In 2006, you had Grogger and Ridgway develop the veil of darkness method, which both you and we have adopted. And had been applied in a variety of places. And I'll be honest with you, when we started this work in Connecticut, we set out to find the one perfect methodology that would tell us if departments are engaged in profiling. And we sat around the table for months and months and months, and we put up on the screen different methodologies to consider, and there would inevitably be a series of things that were really great about that methodology and a series of shortcomings in that methodology. And so we quickly realized that trying to place all of our eggs in one basket was likely not going to be a winning strategy. And so what we ended up with, the approach that took us a long time to get to, was we determined that we wouldn't rely on only one method for analyzing racial disparities in traffic stops. We currently use 7 different methods to evaluate racial disparities in traffic stops. We didn't initially start off with 7. That has evolved over time. So in our first report, I think we used, maybe 5 methods, and every year that we put out a report and we sought feedback, and we've received a number of peer reviews from other academics around the country. And as our researchers have advanced their thinking in this, we've tried to every year incorporate changes into our product. And although I work at a college, I always like to say I'm not really an academic. I'm a policy person, right? I don't have my PhD in economics. We have smart people like Matt who get to do that work. And so the balance we're always trying to have is, creating a product that's always improving, that the public can understand, that also tells us what's happening. And so we rely on a host of descriptive and statistical tests that vary in their levels of assumption and their level of scrutiny. So the intent behind our approach was ultimately to create a screening tool so that we knew and we could understand where we needed to channel our resources. So we call our approach the preponderance of the evidence approach. The idea being that if you're a department that's identified across multiple ways of looking at your data, and you keep showing up with statistically significant disparities, these are all benchmarks that are established before we do the analysis, then that warrants further analysis. That doesn't mean that you're engaged in profiling, but that does mean that we have an obligation to channel our resources to understand what are the factors driving those disparities, and then to go in and to try and propose reforms. So at the end of the day, our annual statewide analysis simply identifies individual departments that warrant further analysis based on significant racial and ethnic disparities that have been identified. And it's worth noting that the threshold that we established in Connecticut with input from all of our stakeholders, in my opinion, and I think Matt would agree, it's a fairly conservative approach, meaning we haven't made it that easy for departments to be identified, primarily because of the resources we had available. And so the advantage of it is that we could mold the analysis around the capacity to do this further analysis and create different tiers of departments. And as resources become more available, we're able to then expand capacity and modify the thresholds that are set for identifying disparities. We set out very clearly in every report we put out 3 guiding principles for our analysis that I would encourage you to consider. The first is, in our reports, we try and acknowledge that statistical evaluation is limited to finding racial and ethnic disparities that are indicative of racial and ethnic bias, that in the absence of a formal procedural investigation cannot be considered comprehensive evidence. We try and state that very early. Our job is to identify statistical disparities that are significant, that warrant further analysis. Principle 2 is to apply that holistic approach to assessing racial and ethnic disparities by using a variety of approaches that rely on well-respected techniques from existing literature. We tried not to reinvent the wheel. We made tweaks so that the methodologies would apply most appropriately to our data here in Connecticut, but we tried to rely on the well-respected research that was already out there about traffic stop analysis. And we outline our assumptions and our limitations in our report. So we try and be completely transparent. If you read our report and you go into the appendix where we provide detailed information about how each methodology is applied, we also try and be honest with folks about the shortcomings of those methodologies so that people don't feel as though we're hiding anything from them. And so the idea being that if we outline our assumptions, the public and policymakers can also use their judgment in drawing conclusions from the analysis. And so the approach used in Connecticut, those 7 methods that I talked about earlier, we sort of rate the methods based on a gold, silver, and bronze standard. And that is essentially when we go to put them all together, how we consider the different methodologies. I'm going to just get into each of these very briefly. I know you've talked probably in detail, and if you have questions about them, we'll answer them. The Veil of Darkness methodology, in our opinion, continues to be the gold standard for evaluating racial disparities in traffic enforcement. It is not because it is a perfect methodology, but it is one of the strongest methodologies that has been out there for the longest period of time and received some of the most feedback. Now, you should know that while we rely heavily on the Veil of Darkness methodology in our assessment, we've also tasked our same research team that's applying the Veil of Darkness methodology to go out there and find ways to challenge the methodology, to conduct additional research and to produce additional academic journal articles that will further advance that particular methodology. And so I know that there was some talk at some point in California, and I think at some point folks even referenced one of the papers that Matt, who's on the line, had done challenging some of the assumptions in the Veil of Darkness methodology. That is not done because we don't believe in the methodology. That is done as a way to try and continue to improve the methodology in the future. So that is still considered our gold standard for evaluation. The synthetic control model, we initially started off our analysis trying to figure out if there was a way to compare like towns to like towns. We wanted to do a peer group analysis. And in our first analysis that we produced in 2015, we had actually created a methodology where we compared one town to 5 like towns. We've since moved away from that methodology into this more statistically rigorous approach that we call the synthetic control model, but essentially it's our take on a peer group analysis. We then do descriptive statistics. These are considered our bronze standards. These are the methodologies that you've seen used for a long period of time. They're easy to understand, they're easy to consume, and they mostly rely on census-based benchmarks, statewide average, an estimated driving population, and a comparison to resident population. We understand that for many in the academic community, they sort of pull their hair out with some of these methodologies because of the assumptions that are built into them. But we believe very strongly that it is important to keep them in the methodology and to show different ways that they should be applied, because we know that naturally people are going to want to make these comparisons anyways. Naturally, particularly the media, is going to want to compare who was stopped in town A to the resident population, as an example. And so we felt that if we applied these and tried to build some controls in for how they were applied, that at least people would start to understand the degree to which they should be given any weight in outcomes that are derived from them. More recently, in the last 2 years, we've implemented a stop disposition test. This is looking at, we call this part of our post-stop analysis, are people being treated fairly as a result of a stop? Are they receiving similar outcomes for similar violations? And lastly, is a test that's been around for a very long time, the KP hit rate test, which is essentially evaluating searches and police's success rate of searches. Again, we consider the Veil of Darkness methodology to be the gold standard in statistical evaluation. If racial bias is driven by the ability of officers to observe the race of a driver before making a stop, then we should observe a statistical disparity between the rate of minority stops occurring in daylight versus darkness. So it is able to manipulate the presence of light in trying to assess racial disparities. We have still, it's very much in the early phases of research, but some of the work that Matt has been doing in recent years has been trying to move beyond just using those inter-twilight periods, the times when it's light out and dark out at the same time, to trying to figure out if there's a way to incorporate visibility based on weather patterns. So on days when it's cloudy out and raining, visibility is decreased, and is there a way to modify this methodology to broaden our sample size? We consider this to be the strongest and most accurate test. That being said, we've also considered it to be the most conservative test. And so in our opinion, we believe that the veil of darkness methodology has a much more, due to the way it is set up, it is possible that it will miss disparities where disparities exist, whereas we don't feel that when it identifies statistical disparities, we're fairly confident that those disparities exist because it is such a hard test, and the safeguards we've placed on it are fairly robust. And we run a number of robustness tests on the methodology to ensure its accuracy. And so one of the reasons people sometimes say, well, why don't you just rely on this? You're saying it's the gold standard, it's the best standard. Why aren't you just using that? Because there's a number of departments in Connecticut that don't make enough traffic stops to have a large enough sample size to have this methodology apply to them. And so, we want to still ensure that every department can be evaluated annually. And also, we believe that the test is designed to be conservative and therefore potentially will miss departments that warrant a further analysis because of the way that it is designed. The synthetic control, again, this is sort of our take on a peer group analysis. This is that silver standard. We try and compare like towns to like towns. It does use some census data to try and compare characteristics and demographics of different communities, and it is applied to a number of different treatment groups. Those descriptive statistics, I'm not really going to spend much time on because I'd like to get to our discussion. It's a comparison of departments to a statewide average, an estimated driving population, and a comparison to resident stops. There are a whole host of modifications that are made to these benchmarks to try and account for different things. So, and you can read about that in all of our reports, and they're very easy to understand. But essentially, these are the types of methodologies that had been long used before methods like the veil of darkness came onto the scene. The stop disposition test, again, we're testing for disparities in outcomes of traffic stops. Essentially, what we're trying to see is, are people receiving similar outcomes for similar stops? White drivers stopped for speeding, in town A, are they receiving a similar outcome as black drivers, Hispanic drivers, male drivers, female drivers, as an example? And then lastly, the KPT hit rate test has been around since 2001. It tries to evaluate the successful nature of police searching across different minority groups. And so at the end of all of this, you say, well, what you're left with is 7 different methodologies and different outcomes, and there's different thresholds established within each methodology for determining what is statistically significant. And at the end of the day, the question is, okay, how do we put all this together? Now we've got departments showing up on some tests and not other tests, and showing up, exceeding the benchmark here and not there. And so we've designed a system to pull it all together, to rate departments, and ultimately to establish a criteria for if you meet this criteria, you are identified for a further analysis. So there's 3 ways you can be identified for further analysis in Connecticut. One is you show up on the Veil of Darkness test. That's the only test where if you only show up on that test, typically in the past, if you show up on that test, you're showing up on most of the others as well. I don't think we've had a case where a department has shown up on the Veil of Darkness methodology and hasn't shown up on the other tests. But if you show up on the Veil of Darkness methodology, you're identified for further analysis. Typically, out of the 107 police departments annually, we've identified anywhere between, I think, as few as 2 and as many as 5 in a single year that have met the threshold within that methodology. The second criteria is if you show up with statistical disparity in that synthetic control or that peer group methodology and any one of the other methodologies, the descriptive statistics, the stop disposition test, or the KPT hit rate test. So if you meet the synthetic control plus one of those, you're identified. And lastly, if you're identified across all 3 of those the descriptive statistics, the stop disposition, and hit rate, if you hit on just those 3 and none of the other 2, you're identified for a further analysis. So what happens when a department is identified in Connecticut is an in-depth follow-up analysis is conducted to help answer the following question. What are the factors contributing to racial and ethnic disparities in traffic stop data for departments identified in the annual analysis? That's the part of the analysis that we tend to spend the most amount of time on now. The follow-up analysis does not have a one-size-fits-all approach. It's tailored based on the department and community's unique characteristics. So what was happening early on is we would do this statewide analysis. We'd say to Department A, you've got disparities. And what we didn't want to do was leave them saying, well, but your methodology is wrong because you didn't account for, all my calls for service come from this sector, or all my accidents come from a neighborhood that has more Black residents living in it, or, we participate in federally funded enforcement campaigns, and the only place we can put spotters for cell phone checks is on this off-ramp. Law enforcement always want you to consider unique characteristics about their community. And the truth is that it's just not possible at this point to do that for 107 departments every year. And so again, the idea being once you're identified, we then go in and we map your stops. We look at stops by neighborhood level. We look at how your patrol pattern is, where officers are placed. Why are there 3 officers in this district and 1 in this district? How do you participate in federally funded campaigns? Where is your crime? Where are your calls for service? Where are your accidents? Where's your traffic volume? What drives law enforcement to this neighborhood? What drives law enforcement to do this type of enforcement in neighborhood A, but a totally different type of enforcement in neighborhood B, right? These are all the types of conversations that we have. And ultimately what we produce is an in-depth follow-up report specifically on that department. The follow-up reports tend to be long. They tend to have a lot of information in them. But at the end of the day, what they also have is we clearly try to identify the factors that we believe are driving the disparities in that town, and we try to identify what are reforms that department can engage in to reduce and eliminate the disparities that have been identified. We've also found that process helps us to learn more about things that we can try and build into our analysis in the future. So what we've found is that a lot of departments do a lot of federally funded enforcement campaigns. So how can we engage the state to incorporate that into an initial analysis are the types of things that we take away from our analysis. Our follow-up analysis, by the way, also includes an officer level analysis. So we want to know if there are specific officers driving the disparity or if it's the entire department that is contributing to the disparity. So in Connecticut, we conduct an officer level analysis where we can identify officers that may be driving or contributing significantly to the overall disparity, and then have a conversation with the department about the activities that those specific officers are engaged in. And we can learn a lot, and oftentimes police chiefs learn a lot from that. So lastly, we've been at this for, like I said, close to a decade now. We've been producing reports for 5 years. We in the state of Connecticut and in the state of Rhode Island now are significantly more informed about the factors that drive disparities in policing. We have found that data is a powerful tool that can and is being used to make policy and legal changes. I'm going to use one if I could. I want to be mindful and try and wrap up in about the next 2 minutes, but I'd like to just share with you one very concrete story so that you can understand the impact of data and the impact of this work in reforming change in Connecticut. And I like to use this example because I think for a lot of folks it's very clear. We had identified a department a number of years ago as meeting our threshold for a follow-up analysis. One of the things we noticed right away was that they were a department that stopped significantly more cars for low-level lighting violations than any other community in the state of Connecticut. In a 12-month period, this police department stopped 1,608, and they were a fairly small suburban community, 1,608 cars for some sort of a low-level lighting violation. And those stops were predominantly impacting Black and Hispanic drivers. And that was clearly driving the majority of their disparity in the community. So we had a conversation with the law enforcement. Help us understand why your officers seem to be focused on this violation so much more than other officers and where they apply that, why they're doing it the way they're doing it. And what the chief said was, yeah, well, it's easy. It's part of our roving DUI patrol. We send officers out during peak drinking hours. We tell them, find cars, use any low-level reason you can to stop the car, speak to the driver, where are you coming from, where are you going to, by the way, your tail light's out, okay, you haven't been drinking, fix the tail light, have a nice day. And so you sit back and logically you said, okay, that makes sense to me. I understand the strategy that they've put in place, but I also am seeing the unintended consequence of that strategy. So the next question for the police chief was, how effective is this strategy? Is it working? Are you getting drunk drivers off the street? Because if you are, then, we can lay that out in our report, and you should go back to your community and say, we know that this is causing, this strategy is causing disparities, but here's the outcome, and I stand behind that outcome. And so the chief at the time said, absolutely, it works. We've been doing this for a long time. We get lots of drunks off the street. Okay, how many? Well, I don't know. Okay, so we're going to go in, we're going to pull every DUI that you had during that 12-month period and figure out if it was related to the stop initially being for a lighting violation. We went back to the department about a month later, and what I said to the chief was, can you outline for us what success looks like? How many drunk drivers out of the 1,600 would have to be, of the 1,600 cars stopped for equipment violations, how many of the drivers would have to be intoxicated in order for you to consider that successful? And he had indicated to us that if he saw around 10% success rate, he would think that was successful. Okay, so 150, 160 drunk drivers out of the 1,600 drivers stopped for low-level lighting violations. They were surprised to learn, as we were when we had finished our analysis, that out of 1,608 motor vehicle stops for low-level lighting violations, they found one drunk driver. They found 20 drunk drivers when they stopped cars for speeding. They stopped 40 drunk drivers when they stopped cars for crossing the double yellow line. And so there had been a culture in the department that, low-level equipment and administrative offenses was a good way to cast a wide net to get a lot of drunk drivers off the street. And at the end of the day, it turned out not to be a successful strategy. And when they reformed that, when they stopped doing that, they actually increased their rate at which they were finding drunk drivers because they were more focused, and they eliminated their racial disparity in the data. Those are the types of things we've learned when we've gone into the officer level. And so it's important to know, too, that in May, when we released our 5th report, I always like to say to folks, in this work, slow and steady wins the race. In 2018, it was the first time that our statewide analysis did not indicate significant racial and ethnic disparities. We've been at this a long time. We've identified since 2013 32 of our 107 departments that warranted further analysis. We've gone into those 32 departments and helped them address the disparities that were there. And so to put that, really putting it out there to say that, the strategy is, right, slow and steady wins the way. Keep chipping away at the problem, keep going in, helping departments figure out what's driving their disparity. And we believe very strongly that the Veil of Darkness methodology is still one of your leading methodologies to get there. The last point I'll make is that It might come up. I believe you do some analysis in California where you incorporated accident level data as a way to develop a benchmark for driving populations. That methodology does have merit in the state of Connecticut. We don't collect race data on accident reports, so it makes it a methodology that we can't apply. I will tell you that if in Connecticut we had the ability to, we would incorporate it, and we would probably have 8 methodologies instead of 7. And so I would encourage you not to limit yourself based on shortcomings that you might find in any one methodology. A big tent, a holistic approach, and a preponderance of the evidence approach is likely going to be the most successful approach for you. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to just give Matt, if he's has anything he wants to chime in on, and then I guess we'll take questions or respond to comments.
Sure. I'll just jump on for a second and add that, I'm happy to answer any questions based on, the research side of things from my experience in Connecticut and Rhode Island, and anything specifically related to the Veil of Darkness, since I know that was a topic that sort of got left undone last year.
And my apologies. I was told that I might be confusing some of my states when I was talking Connecticut. We work in a lot of states: Connecticut, Rhode Island, California, Oregon. So I apologize if I confused anybody. And so with that, we'll be happy to, I guess, take questions if there are any.
Can I ask a question? Oh, so guys, thanks for that presentation. It was quite clear, and I like your approach of using all the different methods and looking for preponderance of evidence. I think that's a sort of thorough and careful way of proceeding. I do have a few specific questions about your methods that maybe you can help us. As you've seen from the past, there's some discussion of Veil of Darkness and some discomfort there, and so maybe we'll just raise some of the issues that we had, and you could address them. But before we do that, just in terms of your synthetic comparison method, is this really you're taking average outcomes by department and then you're finding a synthetic comparison match from other departments within the state? And then is there some pre-treatment period and opposed to the way synthetic comparison is usually doing? Or is this like an entropy balance type thing, or what exactly is synthetic comparison? And also what outcomes?
We basically just treat it as like a propensity score for a department, and so we use the stop level data and the stop characteristics, and then also the characteristics of the town, so like the demographics and stuff. We basically just build sample weights based on that, and then we look at the racial composition of traffic stops between Department A, which we're interested in, and then the control with the sample weights.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. And then in terms of the Veil of Darkness, so a couple of questions that I have for you. So one is simply, it's looking at a very narrow window of stops, and in an inter-twilight period, usually where people are coming from work or going to work for another shift, and that's going to be very different than stops that result in a search or that happen during the day or that night. And it seems maybe to kind of sort of, I guess, preference that over the others in terms of methodology seems to be looking for behavior at a given time during the day. And I'll give you just a few others. I have a couple of things to say. Then the other thing I wanted to ask is, so in California, what we see, and I think across the country, is you see disproportionality in stops for equipment violations by race. Mm-hmm. And my guess would be that in part reflects perhaps, differences in poverty and differences in the conditions of people's equipment. And it might be the case that, when it gets dark outside, those equipment violations become more apparent. And that disparity might, and that changes over time. And that could impact the Veil of Darkness inference. And then just also to raise from your letter to us regarding sort of how behavior might be changing if people believe they're under differential scrutiny and if that varies by race. And do we think that qualifies the interpretation? Because those are my comments.
Matt, I'm going to let you take them.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll go through them in order. So I think the first one related to the specific time of day. So, talking with the researchers from your group, it certainly seems like sort of the temporal distribution of traffic stops in California is a bit different than in Connecticut. So for instance, in Connecticut, the intertwilight window, it just happens to coincide with the vast majority of traffic stop volume in the state. And so it's not, most of the traffic stop volume is occurring during that subset of stops, of the subset of time of day anyway. So it's not a huge, it's not an onerous restriction for us. But looking at the distribution from last year's report, it certainly looks like that's not necessarily the case in California. One thing that we've explored doing is what Ken alluded to, is to try to see if we can't use, for instance, variation in visibility coming from weather. For instance, and the appeal there was that it would allow us to use a window of time, when it's always light out. So we basically use the entire days where the traffic stops. And so we've been experimenting with doing some stuff like that. But yeah, I think there is a limitation there in terms of exactly, if you find a disparity with that test, it is just a disparity during that time period and the officers working during that time period, right?
And all of that is taken into consideration as part of the follow-up analysis. So if you're a department identified from the veil of darkness methodology, we tend to go in and look at those times of day to see if departments could be engaged in different, activities during the intertwilight windows that could be contributing to that disparity. So that is considered in the follow-up.
Yeah. So the other thing I'll add. So the second comment about equipment violations. So there's a couple things like that are So I'm going to go through the typical concerns, which are sort of outlined in the letter. So, people are, it makes sense to be concerned that, things like lighting violations or cell phone infractions might be correlated with race and visibility. And so, that might bias the standard VOD test. What people typically have done in the literature is they limit it to moving violations. And again, you're getting this smaller and smaller segment of the sample. So, I mean, there is sort of concerns about generalizability with that. But one thing that we found that we started worrying about is, and Steve Ross and I have a paper on this, but one thing that we were concerned about is, like, even if you just fix and isolate on moving violations, we were worried that the moving violations themselves might be pulled around by the equipment violations, right? So for instance, police officers in Connecticut told us that, that state police would frequently make, cell phone and seatbelt violations on highway on-ramps. And as soon as it got dark and they're unable to do that type of enforcement anymore, they would move to different locations. And so even if you're just fixing on moving violations, the police officers tend to be moving around geographically. And so you might be worried about that's potentially biasing something as well. But what we found in my paper with Steve, we looked at two different sites, and we basically found that to the extent that police officers were moving around and the composition of traffic stops was changing, as long as you fixed on moving violations, you were tending to run into a power issue. And so the direction of the bias was, making it so, you were less likely to identify a town. It was basically making the test too conservative. We also looked at stuff related to seasonality and the behavioral changes. And, what I was hoping to what I'm hoping came across in the letter is that as far as the research that we've done, which is, the moving violations, the geography, concerns about maybe seasonality in the driving behavior, and the behavioral responses, everything that we've done so far seems to indicate that, this potential bias in the VOD tends to make the test too conservative, which, I think there's a trade-off there, right? So from a statistician's point of view, that's really good. You always want a conservative test if you're identifying towns, that there's something really going on there. But from an advocate's perspective, right, it's a real there is a shortcoming there because you're potentially missing discrimination in places where it actually exists. And so that's, as Ken alluded to, that's why we sort of use all these other tests as well.
We also do, it's important to note that one of the ways we try to address the power issue, particularly with smaller departments that just don't conduct enough traffic stops in a 12-month period for the VOD to apply to, is we've incorporated a 3-year rolling analysis as well. So you're not only doing your 12-month analysis, but over a 3-year period, the sample sizes have tended to be, larger and more robust. And so we're far enough along in our data collection effort that we can do that now. And it took some time to get there.
Can I just ask one follow-up question? Do you find that when there's evidence, say, of differential treatment under VOD, that all of the other methodologies align as well? So you're finding that it's actually, if you sort of surpass that, then you're going to find a different hit rate. You're going to find different post-stop treatments and also differences in the demographics.
So yes and no. So in Connecticut, that has not necessarily always been the case. And in Connecticut in particular, we've always had I guess both Connecticut and Rhode Island, we've had a bit of a hard time running, what you folks call the yield rate test at all, because there's just simply not enough searches to really run it for small departments. But like, for instance, with the synthetic control in the VOD, we do see some overlap, but Rhode Island in particular is an interesting case. So, we're, as Ken said, we've been working in Rhode Island going on, I think, 4 years now, and we've finally had, enough data and written enough reports to kind of do like a historical look back at like which towns we've identified in which years. In Rhode Island, I mean, it's the same 5 towns showing up year after year on VOD, the synthetic control. When there's enough data, they pop up in KPT. It's really the core set of departments year after year.
It's the same. I would say it's similar in Connecticut. Over the last 5 years, we pretty much, although we've identified 32 departments at some point, there's about 10 that'll show up everywhere. They're kind of, it's like whack-a-mole. They'll show up one year on one test and some years on all tests and another year on other tests. But it's probably similar in Connecticut with about 10 departments. So yeah. I don't know if that helps.
It is. Thank you. Thanks.
Yes.
Other questions from board members? Yes.
Thank you. Professor Raphael hit a lot of the notes I was curious about. I did have a couple of very quick and maybe a longer question too. One small quick question. I noticed you wrote machine learning on the synthetic comparison slide, but I was wondering, you've also talking about the challenge of having very small data sets especially in Connecticut, for example. So I was just curious, maybe not in great detail, but what that referred to.
Yeah, so this is a little bit outside of my academic discipline, but the fashion in criminal justice right now is to build, I'm going to use their language for it, these things called internal benchmarks. And the trend in the CJ literature is to use machine learning to estimate propensity scores. They don't call them that, but that's the trend. And so there's a big paper by Ridgway and McDonald that do this for individual officers. And we essentially, because we wanted to stick as closely to what people in the CJ literature were doing, we basically took their methodology that they use for individual officers, and we do it for when we do an officer analysis, when we go into the departments, we do it for individual officers, but for the synthetic control, we basically borrowed their methodology and do it for an entire department instead of officer by officer.
So the training sets are a model they've created, or you're training on a small data set and hoping it carries through?
Yeah, essentially it's just a variable selection model. So it's like boosted logit. And so basically you put in, a bunch of demographics for the town, things like time of day, characteristics of the vehicle stop, and you just sort of let the boosted logit predict what variables, make up the sample weights that you're gonna do to construct a control group.
Okay. Well, I had some other quick questions. I just first want to clarify, you don't see the veil of darkness, this kind of approach is applying to pedestrian stops, just to be really
No,
clear.
and actually the other thing that occurred to me, we had this conversation with the research group a couple of months ago, and I think the thing that I said, I think the veil of darkness is pretty tricky with pedestrians, but the thing that occurs to me is, like, with pedestrians, the range of travel is much smaller, and so it would seem to me that you could use census demographics for that a lot better than you could with the driving population, right? Because the assumptions are a lot less onerous.
Yeah. I just wanted to clarify in Connecticut that these are driving
we don't
tests.
do,
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
I also, about the veil of darkness, clearly you have concerns about ambient light and what's really visible and not, or you wouldn't be reaching to, well, I know also to capture other times of day, but you wouldn't be starting to think, are there things we could do with weather patterns and so on. And what I was wondering, so I'm not familiar, is there any research or literature, maybe from sociologists, maybe people doing ride-alongs with officers to actually weigh in on visibility, like actual lived experience, as opposed to our using time of day and knowledge about sun patterns and so on, and then taking this leap about visibility within cars.
Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but Grogger and Ridgway originally did that. And they, in one of their initial studies, they tried to assess the degree to which visibility of drivers was more likely in daylight versus darkness.
I thought they were more speculating. Suppose that there is a difference in visibility.
No, there is also a survey. I always struggle to. I'll try to find it. There's a criminal justice. There's a couple criminal justice researchers that did a survey on visibility conditions, and the results of that were sort of mixed. So they find that basically they find that it is really difficult to see the race, people's race in the vehicle, both in daylight and almost impossible in darkness. But from a statistical point of view, it doesn't necessarily, all we need to know is that it's changing. It can be hard at both daylight and darkness, and as long as it's changing between the two, we still have enough to identify discrimination from. But yeah, there is a paper out there somewhere. I can try to find it.
Yeah, no, I'm just very curious because we say it's enough if there's a difference, but if the difference, in fact, were very minimal, you must be wrestling with exactly these questions if you're thinking about how weather patterns could even change it.
Yeah,
so,
I think the other thing too is, like, for us in Connecticut, we have some of the departments are just really small, and we just end up with a really small sample during the intertwilight window. So we were trying to see if we can grab more of the day.
Yeah, so I guess I'm taking maybe a different viewpoint. Maybe there's somehow, unfortunately, less to mine there than is possible if the visibility isn't, there's difference around there. So you were suggesting that there's some survey literature that you've seen in the criminal justice literature.
There is.
Yeah, so I'm genuinely curious to see more because I'm not as familiar with literature about maybe ride-alongs or other things really weighing on people's lived experience of visibility. And it seems like that's a critical assumption for, probing these models further. I appreciate that you said that trying different models, you start to see consistency between them. That's pointing to patterns in the department. What I was most curious about in Connecticut is, and Ken, thanks for sharing the story about one of the municipalities that was, got them to look more closely at practices. So what I'm curious about is the data collection's been happening for a while. Are there other stories of policy changes, changes in policing practice? I don't know. I remember Waterbury, for example, and maybe, I don't know if that's the community you're talking about, but Waterbury, smaller city in Connecticut, where there are disparities. I think it might have had to do with search rates in particular, but I'm wondering if you have.
It had to do with their application of, it was registration violations. And so we went in and found, they're basically running license plate readers in the predominantly Hispanic neighborhood, and they were drawing the conclusion that unregistered vehicles requires money. There's a socioeconomic impact, and therefore, they'll be more likely to have unregistered vehicles. And so when their cops would go out looking, being told, target unregistered vehicles, they were going to poorer neighborhoods running plates. And so the question became, well, are you creating a self-fulfilling prophecy? If you were to search plates at a similar rate in the whiter neighborhoods, would you find violation rates at a lower rate, at a higher rate, at the same rate? Because it appeared as though they were only doing registration enforcement in the poorer neighborhood, which was linked to racial and ethnic status. And what we found was that they were, when you expose the whiter neighborhoods to the same type of enforcement, the same levels of enforcement, you found violation rates as similarly, right? White drivers were just as likely to drive around with unregistered vehicles as Black and Hispanic drivers were. And so for them, they had to rethink how they deployed their license plate readers and whether it was fair. Now, as we explore that further, what we found is that, the link between socioeconomic status and administrative and equipment offenses tended to be most prevalent with insurance-related issues, right? So we did find a connection between uninsured drivers and poorer drivers and Black and Hispanic drivers, but we haven't found any evidence to support. We've said on a number of occasions, we've looked at it now in 32 departments, we haven't found any evidence to support the claim that Black or brown drivers are more likely to have equipment or administrative offenses, with the exception of insurance, than white drivers. And when in fact exposed to similar types of policing, violation rates are found at the same rate. Now, we know that what drives policing varies based on a lot of factors. So for example, we know that in Connecticut, it's more likely in some places to have Black and Hispanic individuals living closer to or on a major thoroughfare, which is going to be patrolled by police at a higher rate, and the type of enforcement police do on that major thoroughfare isn't going to be the same type of enforcement that they necessarily do in a more suburban community, right? That it tends to be have a higher rate of white individuals, and right, they're out there doing cell phone and stop signs, but in the major thoroughfare they're doing speed enforcement, maybe equipment light enforcement, traffic light enforcement, and so all of that becomes stories of what we've learned. Now keep in mind that we've identified 32 departments. I genuinely could talk to you for hours. We have 32 stories about what is driving disparities and what we've learned from individual departments. All of that came out of the follow-up work. It came out of going in, having conversation with the department, with the community, drilling down on the data, taking what they said and saying, okay, let's see if that's true, right? And trying to move the conversation beyond anecdotes. For a long time, it existed in anecdotes. Well, the assumption is, right, if you're poor, you're more likely to drive an unregistered car. Well, that might be true, might not be true, right? It sounds logical, but let's test it. So those are the types of things that we've tried to do. And so you're right with the story in Waterbury. I don't know where you heard it, but that's good because that's.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm from Connecticut, but I've been interested in policing data across the country in the senior studies, and so I was curious, especially Waterbury is an example of, I think maybe even in 2015-ish, that where the law enforcement also spoke up and said they were concerned about patterns they were seeing, and I had the impression, at least in the news, that they intended to do some, goodwill to do something about it, and so I wanted to know what that trajectory was. So even if we don't have 32 stories we can go through, I'm especially curious, are there any agencies in Connecticut that, as a result of the work with the data, maybe have looked at their search practices, maybe especially searches that are high discretion searches, maybe where driver consent authorized the search, but there wasn't another basis for it, and what law enforcement is doing, if there were any changes in policy or practice.
Yeah, we found that consent search, really in Connecticut, you can search a car with consent, probable cause, plain view, inventory, right? I mean, there's some within the probable cause, we call that other, probable cause, plain view, drug sniffing dog, right? They're all in our other category, but we call those our lower discretion searches. Right. Inventory tend to be no discretion. It's usually a standard operating procedure, right? Cars being towed, it's going to be inventory to get searched. So we actually exclude those from our analysis. But we've found that the consent searches tend to be driving the search disparities in most communities. Black and Hispanic drivers are significantly more likely to be asked for consent, give consent, and consent searches yield very little contraband, at least in the 5 years of analysis that we've conducted. And so an example is Hamden, which is a predominantly white suburban town outside of the city of New Haven. There's a neighborhood that borders New Haven that's a predominantly black neighborhood, and their officers were going in there and stopping cars for lots of low-level equipment and administrative offenses and asking to search the cars they stopped. And they were asking virtually everybody. And the department had expressed to us that that was part of their crime reduction strategy, right? More enforcement, find a reason to interact with people, and the goal was search cars, get drugs and guns off the street. Okay, again, the question became, is it successful? Because you're asking a lot of people if you can search their cars. So are you finding illegal contraband? And what we found was they basically weren't. They had a hit rate in that neighborhood of like 7%, right? And elsewhere, when they were searching cars, mostly related to probable cause, plain view, drug sniffing dog, they had a hit rate of closer to 70%. And so the chief there was pretty bold at the time. I think it's considered less, sort of controversial now. He banned consent searches in the town. He said, you're done. Don't use them. I don't want you to ask anyone. You build a good probable cause. You build, if you do the work to do a good search the car, but stop asking people if you can search their cars. And he got a lot of pushback, to be honest with you, from his fellow chiefs saying, that's crazy. Crime's going to go up. And he also told his officers, you're done. Can no longer stop cars. And he listed out the reasons he didn't want them stopping cars for. Focus on hazardous driving behaviors. He kept the presence of police higher in that neighborhood because it was linked to higher rates of crime and higher calls for service. So he didn't necessarily pull officers out of the neighborhood, but he tried to change the interactions they were having in the neighborhood. And what we found when we went back and looked 6 months later is that their crime rate dropped, their accident rate dropped, and their racial disparity disappeared. And they were searching far fewer cars, but the cars they were searching, they were having much greater success with. They had a hit rate that went from 7% to close to 80% when they removed consent searches and were more focused on searches. And so, again, we've got lots of stories of departments that when we go in, we've also got stories of departments that say, yeah, no, we know consent searches drive the disparity. It's the cost of doing business. We're going to keep doing it. I don't want to tell you everybody has been a reformer. But we've been able to take the story of Hamden to those departments and say, well, this is the outcomes they got, right? Crime didn't spike. Your accident rate didn't go up. People weren't less safe because you were doing things differently.
Yeah. So I want to leave time for others to ask questions, but just to be clear, so Hamden, do you think it's correct to say that Hamden has continued this practice? I don't know if it's an explicit prohibition or encouraging officers to not
it was an explicit prohibition until the chief retired, and the new chief was not as bought into that as a practice. And so then what we've seen is their disparity come back. There's a correlation between leadership, decisions they made, and when those get reversed, it was sort of undone. And that's been unfortunate. That's been in about the last 2 years.
Well, I appreciate that window into policing in the data. Thank you.
Other questions from the board?
Chief Swing, can I ask one really quick question, if I may? Okay. I just would like to ask our speakers maybe about how important they found the descriptive statistics for individual departments to look for the source of the disparity and maybe to take action on their own, given that oftentimes they're just the raw differences that are what resonate with people and that people can understand, and some of the fancier techniques that academics prefer, they can sort of obscure what it is we're seeing. And it sounds like once you work with the department, you drill down into the raw disparities and try to dissect and decompose them. So maybe you could just spend a minute talking about the descriptive statistics, even though they're the bronze category, maybe could you speak to their value?
Yeah, I'll take
Ken,
that
you
one.
mind if I, Ken?
Go ahead, man.
Yeah, no, so I just want to say something real quick, and I'll let you talk about the specifics. I mean, the thing that the thing that I usually like to tell people, and especially other academics, when they kind of go, why are you looking at, the number of traffic stops compared to the census benchmark? There's a ton of assumptions involved. It doesn't make sense. Well, if we find in a given town that, the police are stopping, on average, 2-3 times the minority population in that town, like that's a really important piece of information, right? We might not be able to say something as confidently about, potential discrimination as we would with, say, the veil of darkness or the KPT hit rate, but it tells us something about exposure that we don't get otherwise. And so that is why we include stuff, those types of other measures. I'll let Ken talk specifically about what we use, but.
Yeah, I found that we've done a lot of work around educating departments about how to interpret every methodology. Okay.